Hi everyone and welcome to my Aerostorm's Rogue Guide for Season 5. This is a build that has kind of been floating around for a little while, but it has been massively buffed in this patch. And I think it's actually one of the best starting builds you can play as a rogue, so I want to show you all about it. In fact, I have written a max rogue guide for this as well. I will have a written version here that is not published as of the making of this video, but it's basically ready and it's gonna go live very soon. So you can also go check out the written version of this. I have a planner here that is also part of this guide, and I will go through it step by step. What you see here is the Aerostorm's Rogue, and this build is entirely based around the Aerostorm's aspect and the Vengeful aspect. These are two aspects that produce those rain of arrows that you can see here in this little area. You can have 7 of those at the same time. That was improved from 5. And they also massively buff the damage of those aspects. And this is what you deal damage with in this build. There is Flurry and Puncture that you can see here on the bar, but these skills are exclusively support tools, basically buffing your damage or giving you more attack speed or actually triggering those lucky hits. This is the main reason to use them. And we don't actually invest into any skill to deal damage. It's all coming from the aspects, which is a pretty interesting concept. And in fact, this is kind of like the entry-level build for an Andariel's Rogue later, which is one of the best builds in the game, the way it looks right now. It was already really good in Season 4, maybe you have seen the Andariel's Rogue, and this entire setup is actually fairly similar to that. So it's very easy to go from this, and once you get the Andariels, you can switch to the Poison version, basically. And you don't really have to do sweeping adjustments to the entire setup. So that's a really cool part about it. It kind of feels and plays similar to that, and you have like a smooth transition later on. Now let's jump in and see what it's all about. So here's the planner, and we have two different setups. I have a standard version and an Uber Unix version that you can see here on the bottom left. You can switch the setups as well, but I will also have this here in the written guide as well. There's only one real big difference, which is that for the Uber Unix we use Teriel Smite. Now in the patch notes, this is not updated in the planner yet, but a bunch of uniques have been buffed pretty significantly that I will show you guys real quick. And one of them is Teriel Smite. That one is the craziest item in the entire game now. That is like the next Shaco, and Shaco was also buffed, by the way. So there's that. But Teriel Smite is something that you kind of want to aim for later on if you want to stick to Aerostorms and not, for example, go for Andariels, or maybe you just get unlucky with the Andariels or something. But it's a very powerful item that you want to include in mini builds now. So this is what the new Teriel Smite looks like. It has lots of damage reduction, insane amounts of maximum all res, insane amounts of res, and then the movement speed on top of it. And then you have this proc here. It's just 0 right now in the preview, but we don't care that much about the proc anyway, but it's just a very powerful defensive tool. So much so that you actually want to use Teriel Smite over a chest that has Dark Shroud ranks, for example. Such as Shroud of Conduras. This is another new unique that comes in Season 5. It's actually a very good item, and in the starter version, I would say this is really nice to have because it gives you those Dark Shroud ranks and gives you a bunch of rest that you need. And then it gives you this immunity effect of Dark Shroud, which is very nice in like pit boss fights in particular. You can just walk in and you see that, you know, one of the shadow bosses does an attack to you. You can just press Dark Shroud, you are immune. It says 3 seconds, it's actually getting nerfed to 2 seconds, but that's good enough anyway. And on top of this, you can also stack up enemies with this, which is actually very helpful for Aerostorms. So the area is very tiny, as you can see here in the clips. It's only like a very small area, and sometimes you do this evade, this pull in from the Shroud of Conduras. Very nice effect. And in fact, you can actually also just stick with this if you want. You don't have to go for the Teriel Smite. Teriel Smite, I guess, has the least value for the rogues out of all classes, but it is still a very powerful defensive choice. So it makes you very tanky, but you lose the ability to pull enemies together. That's kind of up to you, I guess, in the end, to decide which one you want to go for. So I just want to give you both these options. And before you get Shroud of Conduras, this is one of the new uniques that you have to go farm from the Infernal Hordes. You can just have any random normal chest that has life, Dark Shroud ranks, and you know, some defensive aspect like Might aspect, for example. Another new unique that we include here is the Call of the Nameless. So again, here's a new version. This one has 3 different passives on it and lots of crowd control duration and extra lucky hit. Now this build is based on lucky hit. You want to try to stack up lucky hits, so this is actually a useful effect here. And those passives actually have quite a lot of power. In particular, the Trig Attacks. Trig Attacks has been reworked to be a very, very powerful offensive passive now. This used to be a utility passive actually. And we have this here. So you get with 3 ranks, you get up to 36% crit chance and 36% crit damage. So this is pretty wild. And of course, you're going to invest those 3 points, and then you can get another 3 from the helm. So instead of 36, you can get 72 crit chance and crit damage. So this is wild. This is extreme value, but you have to daze and stun enemies, which is easy to do as a rogue. Any build can do that very easily. If here, for example, we have concussive strikes, or just any kind of, you have like a smoke grenade here as well for days. So there's various ways of getting this effect. It just doesn't really work on bosses that don't spawn adds. So you will notice that on bosses you're going to be a bit weaker because trigger attacks won't be active. At least on some boss fights it can be active. Some bosses do spawn adds, and then you get actually a huge power spike. So you have to be aware of this, that sometimes you do way more damage against the bosses than other times. But this is just how it works. But either way, Call of the Nameless is a pretty powerful item, not just because of trigger attacks. We also get unstable elixirs ranks, which is also a rework passive here that allows you to press potion to get a damage buff. It's 6% per point. And we also want to put this, for example, on our neck. And at some point you get to like 50% extra damage or so from pressing a potion for 10 seconds. So you want to kind of like include your health potion as part of your damage rotation. And while in a pit, for example, you regularly drop potions, you're not going to have trouble with that. And also on the boss fight, if it's like not a, multiple minutes long boss fight, at least during the stagger phases, you press a potion, just kind of need to learn that muscle memory. And then you have like another really huge damage buff here. So there's lots of good stuff coming. And this is kind of like the 2 uniques that we have here that are pretty important. We also have the Fists of Fate. Fists of Fate is another item that is getting a pretty massive buff. I will show that. So it's this one. This was actually already shown at the live stream. Maybe you have seen this, but Fists of Fate now has really good stats. So you have some crit, some attack speed, some lucky hit, all of that we want. And a lucky hit is a lot, as you can see here. 51.8% is the maximum roll. This can be a greater affix, making it instantly maxed and giving you this 50% bonus. So you can have 100% lucky hit or something on this item. It's insane how much lucky hit you can have. There's even crazier later on, for example, for the Andariel's rogue, where you actually don't cap out with your lucky hit, because in Aerostorm's build, you only have a maximum 7 Aerostorms. And if you hit like a certain threshold, you will always have those 7 Aerostorms, and you can't really increase your damage that much beyond that with extra lucky hits at least. For example, for other lucky hit builds like Andariel's, this is possible, and for that, having the Fist of Fate already, and then you get Andariel's later, as I described, you can do a switch. This is one of those items that really elevates that build. And on top of this, we have a relatively strong effect here. The attacks randomly deal between 1 and 300% normal damage. This means the average is 150%, so you have a 50% overall damage increase. Now you have to see that for Fist of Fate, this counts per attack. So this means that if you proc 1 Aerostorms, the entire Aerostorm, it lasts for 3 seconds, it will roll either 1% or 5% or 10% or whatever it rolls, and the entire Aerostorm will do that damage. So it's not like you get all these ticks. You see that Aerostorms ticks very fast when we attack, and let's say the boss here, you see like, it's like many numbers all the time, but it's per Aerostorm. Each Aerostorm ticks 4 times per second for a total of 12 ticks, and each of them will have a certain value with Fist of Fate. But since you constantly re-trigger this and you trigger multiple Aerostorms per second, it will average out relatively quickly, and it should be consistent enough with the Fist of Fate. So very good item, and you also have this here as a chase target. This is obviously relatively hard to get. You mostly want to focus on the lucky hit value here because this has the biggest range. The crit and attack speed is nice, but it's not that crazy to get like 8% or so here. The lucky hit is the kicker. And then of course we have the effect here for the up to 300% damage. You want to try to get as high as possible on this one. And of course there's also the chance to apply a random crowd control effect for 2 seconds, which is really nice on a build like this, because you can get slow, daze, stun, immobilize, everything at once. And this also allows you to stagger bosses really fast. So Fist of Fate is really a powerhouse for rogues, in particular for these proc-based builds like the Everstorms or the Andariels. Now there are some more unique options that you could consider here, but I think those 3 are really what you want to go for. So Call of the Nameless, the Kanduras, and the Fist of Fate. And then later on, if you have materials, you can go for that chest instead, if you want to be a bit more defensive. There would be other options here as well. For example, there's a new Crown of Lucion that gives you lots of damage on the helm, but you have to like constantly somehow spend some resources, which is not that easy to do on a build that mostly spans puncture, but you do have flurry for that. You could even consider something like a Starless Skies, but it makes the timing even tighter. You only have a 3 seconds buff where you can spend resources and then stack up the buff, so it's kind of clunky to try to use that. So for people that are asking about this, yeah, technically there are some choices you can make to squeeze out more damage, but it's gonna massively increase the clunkiness of the setup. So I didn't go for that. Now let's talk a little bit about the rest of the setup here. So we have some more aspects. Umber's aspect, of course, goes into your build. Any rogue build wants to have Dark Shrouds. This is how you generate Dark Shrouds. And we're gonna invest lots into this skill. This keeps us alive, gives you lots of damage reduction, like 60, 70% or so, depending on the ranks. And they also buffed it. Now you get 25% movement speed, 50% chance to not be consumed. You get a 10% crit buff there. You can also go for the healing here if you want. If you feel like you are not really recovering life well enough, you can go for Subverting Dark Shroud, but usually you want to go for the crit. And you constantly have 5 Dark Shrouds basically, because they also gave it a cooldown now. There's a 1.5 seconds cooldown for Dark Shrouds to disappear when you get hit. So even if you take many hits, you will not lose Dark Shrouds very fast. And this means you always have 5 or 4 Dark Shrouds because you're constantly attacking, you're constantly generating more Dark Shrouds. With the amount of lucky hits you have in this build, it's going to be easy peasy to stay at 5 at all times, basically. So very powerful. We have the concussive strikes here. This is just extra damage against dazed targets. And we get a dazed chance. So this is no problem. We have the smoke grenade. We have chance to daze here. So we're just going to trigger that. Then we have the vengeful aspect on the two-handed weapon and the arrow storms on the neck. It doesn't really matter which you put where, because they're basically the same. So here, damaging a vulnerable enemy has a chance to create an arrow storm, and here's marksman or cutthroat skills have a chance to create an arrow storm. They have both the same chance, they have both the same damage. So it doesn't really matter, actually. You do make enemies vulnerable very easily with just a puncture. You just always trigger this. So it doesn't really matter which one you put there. Just whatever is like your stronger power. Maybe in case you haven't found the maximum version yet, then you just put that on the two-handed weapon and the other one on the neck. You want to have both because they also buff each other here with the last line. You see arrow storms deal extra damage. So you want to have both these aspects. And like this, you trigger them very reliably. Your goal is to trigger roughly 2.5 to 3 arrow storms per second, since the cap is 7 in the last 3 seconds. So you want to make sure that there's a bit of an overlap so that you don't actually sometimes get unlucky and run out of arrow storms, or don't reach the cap at least. So something like 3 arrow storms per second is the target. And this is like very easily achieved with all this lucky hit that we have in the setup. So I talked about the Fist of Fate. I talked about, you know, some other like hit bonuses, and for example, from the Call of the Nameless that has extra lucky hit. And we also have the reworked Alchemical Advantage passive here. So we have this. This one is also a crazy passive now. It gives you lots of attack speed and lots of lucky hit all in one go. And you can also put this on the neck now. For example, we have a neck. If you can get something like this here. Now, of course, this is a pretty crazy neck, but this is kind of like a chase target here. You want Fidget Finesse ranks, lots of damage against frozen enemies. And then Alchemical Advantage is really nice to have for the extra lucky hits and attack speed. And then also Unstable Elixirs, as I mentioned earlier, is like a pretty powerful passive now. There are other passives as well that you can put there. There's also crit you can put, or cooldown, or movement speed. It doesn't have to be just triple passives. That's really hard to get. But there are many options here of good stats on the neck. Fidget Finesse, though, is the #1 priority, I would say. Another new aspect that we have here is the Cold Clip. This makes your basic skills imbued with Cold Imbue. Pretty cool. And it gives you extra damage against chilled and frozen enemies, which is kind of the real kicker here. In fact, it's getting buffed to 35%. So we kind of like go with the theme of, you know, freezing enemies, stunning enemies, dazing enemies. We get a lot of extra damage there, which also makes it so that when enemies become unstoppable, you have to be aware you're not going to do any damage to them. Or a boss that is not staggered, you have to stagger the boss in order to do real damage, which makes arrow storms not really so great at pushing like the highest tiers in the pit, but up to like 100, 110, 120 even, you're not going to have that much trouble. You can still stagger the boss a few times, and you will deal damage, like a lot of damage during those stagger phases. But when the boss is not staggered, it's kind of like the same thing for most rogue builds, but here it's a bit more amplified, I guess, that you just don't deal much damage when the boss is not staggered. However, we do have an easy way to stagger the bosses, since we have all these crowd controls on the Fist of Fate, and we have the crowd control duration here on the Call of the Nameless. That's a pretty significant chunk that actually allows you to stagger bosses more easily, because the longer the crowd control you apply, the more stagger you build. So this build will actually probably not have as much issues as other rogue builds against bosses because of the Call of the Nameless. Then we have the inner calm aspect here. Just stand still as much as you can, especially on boss fights, for example. During those stagger phases, you can get 30% extra damage. We have a retribution aspect here, extra damage against stunned or knocked down enemies. So we can trigger that from Fist of Fate, or from, for example, just having like a stun roll. For example, here you can put a stun temper, is a utility temper on the boots or something, so you can get that. And as far as I know, they also didn't fix the double dip bug with Retribution. So in Season 4, you got this effect twice on staggered bosses, and it might still be the same in Season 5. At least there's no indication in the patch note that this was changed. So Retribution against staggered bosses, again, pretty powerful. And we have the elements aspect here. That's like the last one. Just another random offensive power. You don't really play around this. It's just there or it's not. And you go with this. Now there is one other weapon here that I want to highlight, which is the Umber Crux. This is a new dagger that was introduced in Season 5 that allows you to spawn a totem. And you can hit that totem to then spread damage to enemies around it, basically. Now this item has been nerfed a little bit, and it was also a bit buggy on the PTR, where if you hit it very fast, you would actually deal more damage than it says, giving you actually quite a damage upgrade. I'm not sure if that was changed. They nerfed it to only one totem instead of 2 totems, but I'm not sure if they've done any other changes. And Arrow Storms is a build that hits very, very fast, allowing you to benefit from this extra damage effect, basically. So we'll have to see if this was addressed or not. Maybe Armor Crux is going to be the next unique to also put in here, depending on what changed with this item exactly. So keep that in mind at least. The stats that you want to put on your gear, I talked about Lucky Hit. You want to have that, for example, on the rings. And of course, a good roll on the Fist of Fate. So this is kind of like carrying the Arrowstorm procs. Then you want a bunch of crit chance. And the rest is just like maybe some attack speed, some dex, some life, some Dark Shard ranks or Subterfuge ranks, very useful. So you can, for example, also reduce the Swirl Grenade cooldown if you have extra Subterfuge ranks. That gives you like the entire category. And of course, you want movement speed here on the boots, maybe even on the neck if you want to try to go very fast. That's very nice to have. And this is a close quarters combat build. So we try to stack up some damage to crowd controlled enemies. So for example, here I can temper this on the offensive temper slots. So we have that here. I have it on the jewelry. And then there's also a new temper that's really powerful. It's damage per dark shroud shadow that you can see here. You want to try to mix this up a little bit with the damage to crowd controlled. They're both in the same slot, both offensive. But effectively, while you get a multiplier from close quarters combat here by stacking damage to crowd controlled enemies, this multiplier eventually does not outweigh just having a lot more additive damage from the dark shroud shadows. Because you usually have 5 Dark Shroud Shadows, so this number here is actually like almost 540% or so additive damage from this one-handed weapon that you can have here. There's another one, so I owe it at like 1100%, and you also have another one here, for example, you have like 2000% or so additive damage. And this effectively gives you roughly like double damage or so of what you would usually have with like other options that you would temper here, for example. And it's a lot of extra power. And this actually is stronger than just stacking more damage to crowd control for close quarters combat. So there is kind of like an equilibrium here that you try to reach. And I would just say kind of like do it like half-half, like, you know, 2-3 items with crowd control damage, and then 2-3, maybe 4 items with damage per Dark Shroud Shadow, because it's a very powerful temper. And of course, for some of our other tempers here, we want a chance for Puncture to cast twice. You can easily hit 100%, even with just 1 Masterwork crit, as you can see here. Puncture cast twice, they're very good. And then we have Cult Observation here. That's just, you know, on the boss, for example, they did make it so that the damage effect does not stack up anymore. So this Cult Observation is not as important as it was in Season 4. But Cult Observation is still just kind of nice because you throw it on the cult drops and then just forget about it for like half a minute or something. You can also do, for example, a cult size instead of a cult observation here. I can like do like 1 and 1. I have double cult observation, so it's kind of up to you. There are some options here, and you can also go for maybe some more puncture casts twice, for example, early on when you haven't masterworked your gear yet. For example, maybe replace one of those cult ops rolls and then put in another puncture roll. So just to get to the 100% more easily. Here we have some resource tempers on the rings for agility cooldown reduction. Just gives you like more dashes on the more shadow steps, for example, if you use shadow step. Yeah, this is just like nice to have. We don't really need anything else there. And movement speed that we have here on the boots and so on. There's also some defensive tempers you can put on your gear, especially before you get all of those unique items. Dodge chance is kind of nice. You can also use armor if you want to reach the armor cap and you don't have another way. There's also siphoning strikes, which is kind of nice, gives you lots of healing. And there's also the new maximum life while Dark Shroud is active. It will always be active, so there's also a relatively strong option here to put in a defensive slot. I went with Dodge Chance, but you can do one or the other. There's a bunch of good stuff here. Now for the skill tree, I showed a few things already, but I want to talk about more in detail about some of these choices. We have the puncture that gives us the triple puncture and allows us to make enemies vulnerable, so we easily have that effect active. We can trigger our vengeful aspect here for the arrow storms. So this is like a nice all-around package. Then we have these passives here, Sturdy and Siphoning Strikes for healing and for DR. We have Flurry with only 1 rank. Flurry is not our DPS in this build. This is the arrow storms. Flurry is just a support skill, similar to the Andarius Rogue in Season 4, for example. We use combo points, and when you build 3 combo points and then use Flurry, you get a 45% attack speed bonus for 3 seconds. So you want to try to activate this regularly when you fight elites and the bosses. And then you can also use Flurry to jump around. So there's the improved Flurry where you dash to a target. It works a little bit like the Shred from the Druid. You dash to the target, so you can actually use this as a mobility tool. So you can, instead of dash into a pack, you can just right-click Flurry into a pack and then use dash to move away from the pack you have just finished, for example. So this is a very powerful mobility tool now. And then we have the Caltrops with the extra damage taken and the extra crit chance here. We have unstable elixirs and trigger attacks for big damage. So make sure you press the potion every 10 seconds. Dash has also been redesigned a little bit. You now get some 10% crit chance here, and you also get a shorter cooldown and extra charge from a methodical dash. Very cool. And we also put 5 points in there just to lower the cooldown, because if you have, you see here, more ranks, it starts at 9 seconds, goes down to 7.38, and this is before cooldown reduction is applied. And then you also get the extra minus 3 seconds here. You have a lot of dashes. So you're going to be very mobile, even with just dash and no shadow step on the bar. Dark Shroud, you want to fully invest into this for the damage reduction. We have the Smoke Grenade as well. We just put the extra points there as well. Same story here, like the dash, you have a shorter cooldown. Smoke Grenade now also works on bosses for 25% extra damage. It's very nice. So you want to try to throw this regularly. In case you use Umbra Crux, you'll also trigger the Umbra Crux with the, spawning the totem by using the Smoke Grenade. And we also have Subverting Smoke Grenade now that applies a poison dot. And this dot doesn't really do damage, but it is activating our alchemical advantage and debilitating toxins here. So this is mostly why you want to use that. If you go with any other source of poison, there are some other options. You could do a Pestilent Points aspect. You could do a Poison Trap as well instead of the Caltrops if you really want. So you don't have to go Caltrops necessarily. For example, you can do this here with a knockdown and a Poison Trap, and then you could also go, for example, for countering Smoke Grenade and just have more Smoke Grenades because it resets the cooldown. It's very nice. And down here, we don't take any imbuements. Even with the Cold Clip aspect, we don't actually invest into Cold Imbuement. We just kind of like ignore that, but we do chill anyway by just having the Cold Clip aspect here. Creature Finesse, very powerful. And that's the Close Quarters, yeah. So this is the setup. Now, there's a slight tweak here. If you go for Uber Uniques, you don't want to have the Dark Shroud on the bar, because Dark Shroud on the bar is only useful when you have the Shroud of Khanduras for the immunity effect. If you don't use that Chester, you don't need Dark Shroud on the bar. In that case, you can actually go for Shadow Step, or again, you can go and maybe throw in like a Death Trap, or you can throw in a Poison Trap, or even Concealment. There's like a bunch of options here. But I just like to have Shadow Step. It gives you an Unstoppable to break CCs. And it also gives you just like lots of mobility. You're super fast with this. So it's nice to have when you have Anterior's Might instead. Even with Shroud of Khanduras, you don't have to go for Dark Shroud. You can still do exactly the Shadow Step setup if you want. And lastly, here we got the Paragons. So we have a 6-board setup with 6 glyphs, and we also have a bunch of pretty important legendary nodes. Those are, we have Exploit Weakness. Exploit Weakness has been redesigned to give you now a stacking damage buff that goes up to 25% and then stays at 25%, and then it drops and you have to restack it. So it's a kind of like a really powerful inclusion here, especially for a build that has a lot of lucky hit. Very nice. We have Deadly Ambush, gives you lots of extra crit damage. In fact, all damage, even if you don't crit. This is bugged, but it doesn't really matter since we mostly crit anyway with this build. And in this case, you just need to activate it with trap skills. So trap skills are Caltrops, or for example, Poison Trap that I mentioned. So you don't have this all the time, but you have it on the bosses at least. You just throw the Caltrops on them, get this buff here, very powerful. We have Cheap Shot. We CC a lot of targets very easily. So Cheap Shot is also 25% extra damage when you have at least 5 targets or staggered boss. And the rest here is mostly just stacking up glyphs. We have Chip for physical damage. Arrow Storms is physical. We have the Control Glyph here for the close quarters combat. Gives you lots of crowd control damage. And then also this extra damage against stunned and frozen enemies, which you do all the time. We have Turf here. This gives you damage reduction against close. We have Pride. Gives us extra physical damage against healthy and injured, and also buffs these nice rare nodes here for more crowd control damage and damage reduction from slowed enemies. Since you have puncture, we slow very easily. Then we have Ambush. This is mostly again for the bosses when you throw down a Caltrops, for example, but again, extra damage against trapped enemies. And lastly, fluidity. You might be wondering why fluidity for the extra energy. No, it's just, it gives you a 10% damage buff when you use dash. You dash all the time, so use that. And it also has pretty nice magic nodes buff here. There's 9% life that we get from this, for example, and a bunch of other small stuff. So this is the Paragon setup. Can kind of just like, progress through it in this order. You can see the order of the boards, and very easy to kind of just build as you level, and you get most of the important effects pretty early on. Now that was pretty much it for the setup, but there's one last thing that I want to talk about here, and that is the Heartseeker version of this build. So you don't really need to play Puncture to make this setup work, and in fact, as I mentioned at the start, there is a certain kind of a critical mass that you'll reach with your lucky hits, where you will always have 7 arrow storms up, and that is the cap. You can't get more. And if you proc more than around 2.5 to 3 arrow storms per second, you will reach that cap pretty reliably, even in very short fights. And this means that we can actually reduce our total amount of lucky hit and instead try to go for more damage per arrow storm. And this is where Heartseeker comes in. So technically, instead of using swords that we have here right now to use Puncture, we can do this with a crossbow with Heartseeker. Heartseeker actually has a similar lucky hit chance as Puncture. You see here we have 35%. Times 3, so the total is 105. And with Heartseeker, you have 50 times 2 with the ricochet, so you have 100. So it's almost the same total lucky hit that you get per shot. And you can also get similar synergies. For example, instead of the Puncture cast twice, you can go for a Heartseeker cast twice. And the only real difference here is that Heartseeker is just like generally a bit slower. It has like a longer animation than Puncture. Puncture is like very fast. And Heartseeker, you have to shoot with the crossbow. And the crossbow is also just a much slower weapon than daggers or swords. But you will kind of be in the same ballpark in terms of how many lucky hits you produce. Maybe it's going to be something like minus 25 to minus 30% or so. But on the other hand, the damage per arrow storm goes up by a pretty similar amount. A crossbow has the same DPS as 2 swords, but is much slower. You see, it's 0.9 attacks per second, and this is 1.1 attacks per second. So the damage per hit is way higher on a crossbow. It's 22.2% higher than swords. So as long as you still trigger enough arrow storms, once you have a pretty good setup, once you have maybe alchemical advantage ranks, once you have a Call of the Nameless and a good Fist of Fate and so on, you will get to the point where you have enough lucky hit and enough attack speed to make this work. And then you can just switch those points here from Puncture into Heartseeker. You go into the ricochet, so you get the second arrow. You switch your temper to Heartseeker cast twice, and then you shoot with the crossbow. And there's also some other perk here, which is you get a bunch of extra crit chance. You actually stack up 15% extra crit. With Heartseeker, for example, you get much of attack speed that kind of closes the gap between the two skills, and then your ricochet doesn't really do much. So you lose the slow that you get from the Puncture, but you have the Fist of Fate to slow stuff for you anyway, since it gives you all of those crowd control effects. It gives you any kind of random crowd control effect. So you don't really lose anything there. You don't really care about the resource generation from Puncture. So you just switch that setup eventually once you have really good gear. I'm not sure exactly where's the breakpoint here, but at some point you will probably realize, yeah, you're proccing arrow storms like crazy. And then you can go and try this. Again, I would only recommend this if you have really good gear, because otherwise, yeah, you will do more damage per arrow storm, but you will have them less consistently when you have kind of weak lucky hit chances so far. And this means that, for example, when you do like a speed run in a pit, it's all about consistency. You don't want to run into a pack and then wait like 3 seconds for your first arrow storm if you get unlucky. So you want to make sure that you have consistent arrow storms so that you actually clear packs easily, even if the total DPS might be higher with the crossbow early on already. Something to keep in mind here for the late game setup. And now there's only one other problem to solve, which is how do you get vulnerable? Because Puncture also applies vulnerable very easily, and we don't have any other source of vulnerable really. But we have the cold clip aspect, and cold clip has the cold imbuement for our shots. And in that case, we just need to get to enhance cold imbuement. We need to somehow get 2 points here. For example, we can take out debilitating toxins and do this. And like this, your Heartseeker can now also apply vulnerable pretty reliably actually, because you get 2 shots. In fact, you get actually 4 hits every time if you have chance to cast twice, 100%. You get a ricochet, and then you get an extra arrow basically. And you have lots of lucky hit. You will actually trigger the vulnerable very easily with Heartseeker using enhanced cold imbuement, which is permanently applied to all of your shots with cold clip aspect. So this is kind of the other switch that you make here. later on if you go for a Heartseeker build. And that's it. And like this, you can really elevate the Aerostorm setup to its maximum potential. When I played this on a PTR, I was easily crushing like pit hundreds in like speed farming territory, like 2-3 minutes or so, which is kind of what you're trying to reach to get the most Neve iron. And then anything beyond that is just kind of like for fluff, right? For fun to push a little bit higher. As I mentioned, probably not the craziest push build, but all this extra crowd control that I have in the setup actually makes it easy to stagger bosses even on higher tiers, even after multiple staggers. So that should still help quite a bit of the bosses. So I expect Aerostorms to be relatively decent, and once fully optimized, you'll probably get to the point where you do multiple hundreds of millions of DPS with this. So it is fairly strong. It is not like Andaria level strong, but definitely up there as like a really solid starter build. And with that, I'm going to conclude this guide here. So hope you enjoyed this. I wish you good luck with the Rogue in Season 5. I will have more videos coming for all of the classes. Bunch of videos that I'm working on right now. That's just one of the first ones I'm making right now. So hope you enjoyed this. Hope you liked this guide. Let me know if there's any other suggestions you have. Of course, there's a lot of stuff in this patch. So if you maybe want me to cover a certain build, or if you have some ideas for some builds that I do cover, let me know and I'll go check it out. Hope you like this, and I'll see you guys next time.